Good morning.
Good morning from Wildemar. How many people actually drove in today?
Good morning from Lakewood.
Good morning from Calabasas.
Good morning, everyone. We'll get started soon. Sorry about that. Sorry, everyone.
Good morning from West Covina.
Morning from Thousand Oaks.
Good morning from Avalon, California.
Good morning, everyone. We'll be getting started in a few minutes. Thank you.
Where's my volume?
Madam Clerk, can you please confirm that we have a quorum?
Chair, we have a quorum, 19 members. Thank you.
I do apologize for my tardiness. This is Mayor Reyes Alonso.
Welcome, Mayor Reyes. We have not called the meeting to order yet. So you are on time. Ask those, I'd like those members that are calling in by phone to identify yourself before I call the meeting to order. Is there any members calling in by phone? Could you please identify yourself in the phone, in the last 4 digits of the phone number?
Ann Marshall, City of Avalon, 2935.
You have that, Madam Clerk?
Thank you.
Okay, I call this meeting to order. And will the Honorable Rocky Rhodes please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Thank you, Chair. Hand over your heart. Ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. For all.
Good morning. Today is a rainy Thursday, February 1, 2024. It is February. Welcome to those members who are joining us today in person at SCAG's Los Angeles offices. Welcome to all of you. Prior to calling the meeting to order, I would like to ask members who are calling in by phone to identify themselves, and we have done that. As a reminder, if a member of this body is attending remotely, but is not at a location specified on the agenda, they may observe and comment as a member of the public, but may not participate in any member discussion or voting of this body. We are holding this meeting in compliance with Brown Act rules relating to telephonic video conference meetings. SCAG offices are open for members of the public to attend and participate in person. Instructions for providing public comment have been provided in advance and are also included in the agenda packet. Just a reminder, to reduce background noise, please ensure that your microphone is muted when not in use. I will now open the public comment period of the meeting. This is the time for members of the public to offer comment for matters that are within SCAG's jurisdiction, but are not listed on the agenda. Staff, have we received any written public comments after the deadline of 5 p.m. on Wednesday, January 31, 2024?
Mr. Chair, we did not receive any public comments before or after the January 31st deadline.
Thank you, Ms. Macias. Do we have any members of the public who wish to speak?
Mr. Chair, I can confirm we have no members of the public in person or via Zoom who wish to speak.
Thank you, Ms. Macias. I will now close the public comment period, the public comment period for matters not listed on the agenda. Review and prioritize agenda items. I would like to remind everyone to unmute your phone before speaking and state your name during deliberations and whether making a motion or offering a second. And for those who are joined by phone, press *6 to mute and unmute your phone. Do any members of the committee wish to review and prioritize any agenda items? Okay, seeing none. Consent calendar. Do we have any members of the public who wish to speak on this item?
Mr. Chair, I'm not seeing any members in person or via Zoom who wish to speak on the consent calendar.
Thank you, Ms. Macias. In order to save time, if anyone wants to pull anything from the consent calendar, I ask that we have staff presentations before moving to the roll call vote for the consent calendar. Do I have any, do any of the members of the committee want to speak, or do I have a motion?
So moved, Shapiro.
Second.
I had a motion by Ms. Hupp,
Second.
I have a second by Mr. Rhodes. To approve the consent calendar. Did you get that, Madam Clerk?
Yes.
Can you do the
Thank
roll
you,
call
Chair.
vote, please?
Roll call vote for the consent calendar. Ashley Akin. Valerie Mesqua. Gary Boyer.
Yes.
Drew Boyles. Wendy Bucknam.
Yes.
Don Caskey. Deborah Dorst Parada. Bobby Duncan. Thank you. Keith Ike.
Yes.
Bob Engler.
Yes.
Rose Espinosa.
Yes.
Margaret Finley. Claudia Frometta. John Gabbard.
Yes.
Camilo Garcia.
Yes.
Garcia.
Yes.
Thank you. Marshall Goodman. Mark Henderson.
Yes.
Cecilia Hupp.
Yes.
Kathleen Kelly.
Yes.
Tammy Kim. Lauren Clayman. Matt Levere.
Yes.
Jed Liano.
Yes.
Annie Marshall.
Yes.
Andrew Macia.
Yes.
Casey McKeon.
Yes.
John Mirish.
Yes.
Geneva Mahado. Thank you. Joseph.
Yes.
Thank you. Joseph Morabito.
Yes.
Suzette Mullins.
Yes.
George Nava.
Yes.
Ariel Pay.
Yes.
Misty Perez.
Yes.
Freddie Puzza.
Yes.
Gabriel Reyes.
Yes.
Rocky Rhodes.
Yes.
Andrew Sarega. David Shapiro.
Yes.
Becky Shevlin.
Yes.
Mary Solorio. Helen Tran. Mark Warrenock.
Aye.
Tony Wu.
Yes.
Frank Yokoyama.
Yes.
Thank you. Chair, the consent calendar passes with 30 yes votes, 0 no votes, and 0 abstentions.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Mr. Lamb, that was a we approved the consent calendar item number 1, and we received and filed items number 2 and 4 by that motion and second, correct?
That's correct. That's correct, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Okay, moving on. Information item. Item number 5, Governor's Budget Update, Regional Early Action Planning Grant 2021, REAP 2.0. Do we have any members of the public who wish to speak on this item?
Mr. Chair, I can confirm we have no members of the public in person or on Zoom who wish to speak on item number 5.
Thank you, Ms. Macias. This is an information item. On January 16, Governor Newsom announced the proposed budget that includes 1.2 billion in cuts to funding for housing programs, including 300 million for the Regional Early Action Planning Program. Javiera Cartagena, Chief Government and Public Affairs Officer of SCAG, joins us today to provide background and steps SCAG is taking to preserve the program. Ms.
Thank you.
Cartagena.
Thank you, Chair Yokoyama, and thank you to those braving the bad weather. It feels like a movie outside. Anyway, I'm Javier Cartagena. I'm the Chief Government and Public Affairs Officer. I know that you've received communication regarding the threat to our REAP funding, and I wanted to provide a deeper dive on where we are, our current efforts, and where we want you to join us in our advocacy. As the chair mentioned, in January, Governor Newsom proposed a 291 billion budget and a 1.2 billion in cuts for housing programs, including the 300 million for the REAP program. I wanted to highlight that the REAP program is the only program specifically and exclusively designed to implement the region's sustainable community strategies, so the SCS. I don't have to tell this committee that California is in the midst of a housing crisis, and simultaneously, the governor and the legislature have set very ambitious goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So cutting the REAP program threatens our ability as cities, counties, tribal governments, and transit agencies to address the housing crisis while also meeting our state's important climate goals. SCAG has an MOU with HCD for 237 million in REAP funds, and we enter into this last summer. Program staff here today jumped into action to design a program that was dynamic and visionary in addressing our state's housing challenges. And we're proud to say that we're ahead in many ways, even in comparison to our fellow MPOs. SCAG at the moment has allocated and awarded 192 million to cities, counties, tribal governments across the 6-county Southern California region for over 100 projects. And these accelerate our housing production and implement our GHG strategies contained within Connect SoCal. And I wanted to make that important connection that is not just about housing production. These projects are crucial to supporting our efforts to achieve our RHNA goal of the 1.34 million units that we have to do as a region. Reducing or delaying funding will compromise the program's integrity and have severe negative impacts on cities and counties across Southern California and the entire state. I wanted to let you know that both the Assembly Committee on Budget and the Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Committee held a budget hearing on Tuesday, January 23rd, marking the start of the legislative budget process. And so in preparation for the budget hearing, SCAG authored a budget advocacy letter in response to the governor's January budget, including our request that REAP 2.0 funding be protected, which was distributed to the budget committees in advance of their hearings. Also included in that distribution was the legislative leadership of Southern California and key SCAG stakeholders, including CalCog, League of Cities, California State Association of Counties, CSAC, our fellow MPOs, and our region's 6 county transportation commissions. Additionally, talking points were distributed to members of the Assembly and Senate budget committees representing the SCAG region, whose districts contain projects funded by REAP 2.0. Ahead of these meetings and the potential inclusion for that discussion. And I know that Assemblymember Bennett included those in his comments at the hearing. Lastly, SCAG had our Sacramento representative, Cruise Strategies, provide an in-person testimony during the public comment period during the hearings. And also SCAG has been meeting with key legislative staff in the Senate Pro Tem's office and the Senate budget committees. The Assembly is next. These meetings have been going well. I think they're very impressive at how far SCAG has done and has implemented our MOUs, but there's still a lot of uncertainty coming in the next few months. We are in the process of setting strike teams with members of our board to meet with legislators, and we anticipate this being our primary advocacy effort on our upcoming Sacramento Summit, which is going to be taking place in March 19th and 20th. In the meantime, I wanted to let you know that we have developed an advocacy toolkit that we are making available to every SCAG member and elected official. And part of this toolkit, there will be a sample letter. So please modify the template as you see fit and send it to your leadership and legislative friends. So we want all of you to kind of work with us together in our efforts to save this critical program. And I think that concludes my report, Chair Yokoyama, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Javiera. Can you repeat one more time the purpose of the toolkit and the template letter?
Sure. So this is so that you could go back to your city managers and council members, fellow council members, and you can sign on, write a letter, and then express your support for REAP and the projects and send those to your specific local legislators that are part of the districts, of your individual districts.
Thanks. And this is a very important update given to us by Javiera. Similarly, COME will be giving a similar update at the regional council meeting this afternoon. It's very important that we all know this update. It affects what this committee passed just last month in REAP awards that we just passed last month. So that's why it's timely and critical that we understand this. So thank you, Ms. Javiera. I will now entertain comments from members of the CEHD committee. Just a reminder, if a member of this body is attending remotely but is not at a location specified on the agenda, they may observe but may not participate in any discussion or voting of this body. And Mr. John Mirish, I call on you, please.
Thank you. I understand that you're asking all of us to do what we can and we should, but what is SCAG? It would seem, as the largest MPO in the US, that a very strong united letter and actions from SCAG itself would, to the governor, to all legislators, to at least all of the ones in all of our districts, about the vital importance of funding, maybe reminding them that they eliminated redevelopment and therefore the ability to fund these things. What are we doing and what can we do as an organization? Because yes, it's great if each of our cities do something, but SCAG is almost a behemoth, if you will. So what can we do as SCAG?
Yeah, thank you, Member Mirish. We are preparing what we call a NASCAR letter, which will be distributed to bigger coalitions. So that's our bigger coalition letter, in addition to the local efforts. And I think that staff is identifying those potential bigger partners. And
excuse me, when you say partners, I mean, the obvious one would be the governor. This is the governor's budget. So
yes,
shouldn't we be sending this directly to the governor and saying, thanks for all your help in the past, but this is the situation now. And if you're serious about all of the rhetoric that you're talking about when it comes to doing something about housing, you can't cut the budget.
Yeah, we did send a letter directly to the governor when we learn of the cuts, and I can provide you with that letter.
But maybe it's time to do it again with the ratification of the regional council or whatever, and maybe with have it signed by all of the regional council members. That's great if COME or somebody else on behalf sends it. But if there is a letter where every one of them signs, maybe, this is really critical right now. So, but thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really great idea. We'll have that for consideration. Thank you.
Kathleen Kelly.
Thank you. Frank spoke about this, but do we know the precise extent to which the proposed cuts would impact grants already awarded? Or is that yet to be determined if this draconian measure is adopted?
I will have Elizabeth speak to that.
Good
Thank you,
morning.
Member Kelly.
Yeah, thank you, Javiera. Good morning, Member Kelly. Should the governor's budget be successful as it's currently proposed, we would have to reassess the entire REAP 2.0 program. As proposed, it's a 50% reduction of the $600 million across the state, which would mean that SCAG's $246 million allocation would drop down to $123 million. We've awarded the majority, all of our grant programs have been awarded at this point in time. And so should the budget not shift and the reduction go through, we would have to completely reassess our program, and any such consideration would be brought before the regional council.
Elizabeth, can you also share with the committee what SCAG has done regarding stop orders? Is that what they're called?
We provided letters to all of our partners who had received awards, grant awards, and notified them to pause work, that we were pausing the work across the program, just to ensure that we had the opportunity to really assess the impacts of the governor's budget. As noted, should the advocacy not be successful, we would have to reassess the entirety of the program, and including the various awards that we've conducted to date. So we did provide notifications to our partners that were awarded funds last week to let them know of the governor's budget, that we needed to pause programs. We are working on advocacy, and I think that'll be another opportunity to engage with them to as Javiera noted, to bring that support along on the advocacy to really lift up the impact of these dollars across our region, but also at the local level. So yes, notification was provided last week to all who were awarded funds that we are pausing work until we work through this budget issue.
And we will be sending a project list with all the projects, and also containing assembly member and Senate offices that are housed within their districts, the projects that are housed within their districts, to make it easier.
Okay, thank you. I call on Mayor Reyes.
Thank you so much for that information. I was wondering internally, just, stopping work orders and stopping, such an important issue like housing is never the route that we want to go, right? So would there be any maybe possible solutions on projections of what the governor or what the state may see, funding wise would be like next year, or try to get like a couple of years of projections, because maybe we can do MOUs with the state and SCAG, or maybe we can do some type of resolutions where local governments can try to work with developers to specifically address whether it be workforce housing or affordable housing, or incentivize the development of those homes, right? And then maybe delay some type of reimbursement. Just trying to think on, not stopping, the movement that SCAG has been doing, right? Like you guys have been a great part to moving the housing element portion of it through. So not sure if that's something that we can possibly explore, or if maybe, I know that there's something that our city is trying to become a member of, and it's the Public Housing Authority. And I know that the Public Housing Authority has various opportunities for funding and so forth. So just an idea on how maybe we can do some internal collaborative partnerships or collaborative programs to not stop the movement that we have, because we all know momentum is the hardest thing to gain, but the easiest thing to lose, right? So I understand, we're in a tough situation with a deficit, but just trying to throw out a couple of ideas on how we can possibly still keep some type of momentum moving forward.
Thank you, Mayor Reyes. That's a very good point, and something that we are considering as we're meeting with Senate and Assembly staff and administration staff. We were already in a very tight deadline with our REAP funding, and I will remind all of you here today that those were a one-time funding opportunity. So part of our efforts were also to encourage and seek additional funding. As you may know, we have not had a continuous funding stream to support these efforts. So those are very good points and conversations that we will continue to have. As you know, a lot can happen between now and May, and those points are well taken and will be considered as we meet with our leadership moving forward. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Elizabeth. Okay.
You guys are amazing. Appreciate you.
Javiera, thank you for that presentation.
Thank you, Chair.
Item number six, City of Los Angeles Housing Element Assessment of Fair Housing. Do we have any members of the public who wish to speak on this item?
Mr. Chair, I can confirm we have no members of the public on either our Zoom platform or here in person who wish to speak on item number 6.
Thank you, Ms. Macias. This is an information item. REAP 1 funding has been supporting local governments and stakeholders with housing planning activities and projects that accelerate housing production to meet the region's 6th cycle RHNA. Today's presentation to CEHD will go over the City of Los Angeles 2021 through 2029 housing element, affirmatively furthering fair housing analysis project, which was funded under the REAP 1 sub-regional partnership program. Given the state's emphasis on AFFH, affirmatively furthering fair housing, the City of LA's effort can serve as an example of how local jurisdictions are tackling fair housing needs at the local level. I now turn it over to Mayan Johnson, who will introduce the City of LA speakers. Ms. Johnson.
Thank you, Chair Yokoyama, and good morning, members of the CEHD Committee. I'm Mayan Johnson, Housing Department Manager. And I wanted to highlight before I introduce our speakers today, the work that's been done under the REAP 1 program. That was the precursor, obviously, to what you just talked about in the last item for REAP 2. But for REAP 1, which was created in 2019, we're starting to wrap up our projects in the first half of this year. So you'll be seeing a lot more projects being presented, but these are tools that local jurisdictions have implemented to help increase their housing production. So this particular project is for the City of Los Angeles. They had about $8 million allocated to them through our sub-regional partnership program, which was based on the 6th cycle RHNA allocation. So this project is about tackling housing needs through AFFH. And this is one of the main components that they implemented in order to get their housing element successfully adopted last year. AFFH is particularly necessary to address racial and wealth income gaps, and also through homeownership rates, also unequal access to opportunities. So addressing accessibility through AFFH is a crucial component in planning and producing housing. So today's presenters, we have Jackie Cornejo, who is the Finance Development Officer in the Land Development Unit, Maya Aboud, she's a Finance Department Development Officer in the Housing Department, and we also have Nancy Twum Akwaboa, who is the Planning and Economic Analysis and Public Policy Research Unit in the Housing Department for the City of LA. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Jackie Cornejo.
Hello, good morning. I'll get started on a little bit of the background and then we'll pass it on to my colleague Maya for the next portion. There we go. Great. So I'm going to get a little bit into our REAP 1.0 goals. So the City of Los Angeles, as Mayan mentioned, received REAP 1.0 funds for joint efforts between the Housing Department and the Department of City Planning. Today, we'll touch on one of the 4 major areas, which is the affirmatively furthering fair housing. So the City of Los Angeles recently completed its 21 to 2029 housing element, and as of June 29th of 2022 is fully compliant. It was a joint effort by both the Housing Department and the Planning Department, and it took us many years to get to this point. We're going to talk specifically about the AFFH process, some of the things we did well, and some of the areas where we made meaningful revisions to ensure compliance with state law. So a couple of the sections or a couple of the project areas or tasks that we focused on as part of our AFFH work was the housing element assessment of fair housing, which we'll be focusing on today, developing a citywide anti-displacement tool and affordable housing site tool, which will hopefully allow the department to be able to identify sites that are most apt for building affordable housing throughout the city. All this work was done, ensuring that we had inclusive engagement from communities underrepresented in our city's planning processes. And we'll get into a little bit of that in later slides. So on November 24th, 2021, the Los Angeles City Council adopted the general plan amendment for the 2021 through 2029 housing element update. Following adoption, the plan was submitted to HCD for a 90-day formal review process and certification. On the 90th day, we did receive a letter from HCD that stated that while they applauded many aspects of the plan, additional revisions were needed to the city's housing element fair housing programs to ensure compliance with the new state law. We then focused on expanding the identification of AFFH strategies in the housing element. So as previously mentioned, before describing the proposed amendments, I'll just do a brief additional background on the AFFH requirements, which were adopted in 2018 via Assembly Bill 686. AFFH is defined in part as taking meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity based on protected characteristics. With regards to housing elements, the law requires that fair housing disparities are analyzed through an assessment of fair housing, which identifies contributing factors found to be worsening fair housing issues. These factors are then prioritized and then used to create a set of AFFH strategies and actions expected to address these issues. So in response to the new requirements, staff, our team prioritized AFFH throughout the housing element process. And as a result, we believe that our housing element demonstrates an exceptionally strong commitment to AFFH. In particular, the city's adopted housing element included a 109-page assessment of fair housing, which you'll find in Appendix 1.1 of our housing element. A strong commitment to rezoning in a way that affirmatively furthers fair housing, which you can find in our Chapter 4 and under Program 121, and also identify 38 individual housing element programs that include significant strategies and actions to affirmatively further fair housing. And these are grouped and summarized under Program 124 in our housing element. Probably can't see a lot of this small text, but just to give you an idea of what we focused on here. This program and its supporting implementation programs were directly informed by community input and built on the city's previous 2018 to 2023 assessment of fair housing led by the Housing Department. The 38 supporting AFFH programs and strategies address the primary contributing factors identified in our assessment of fair housing, and together chart a course of action for making the city more fair and equitable. In the adopted Program 124, there are three overarching strategies overarching categories. These are linked to individual housing element programs, and then offer more detail on the objectives, metrics, and milestones that correspond to each strategy. Reason why we focus on this level of specificity was because the state really requires jurisdictions to really focus on more concrete and actionable commitments. And so some of the components of our AFH for the housing element, again, focus on fair housing analysis of race, ethnicity, economic status, and disability, our displacement analysis, looking at fair housing enforcement and outreach capacity, site inventory, and prioritization of contributing factors to fair housing issues. In our next section, we'll focus on the data sets provided by HCD that we use to really understand the prevalence of each racial and ethnic group, in analyzing this data really allowed us to understand the complex and nuanced aspects of integration and segregation patterns in the city. And then in looking at racially concentrated poverty in lower resource areas, this analysis is intended to help us better understand how land use decisions, and how they impact where residents have the opportunity to live with a healthy environment, have access to safe schools, safe housing, parks, transportation, and all the goals we set as a city to improve the lives of all Angelenos. And the contributing factors to fair housing, this was an identification and prioritization, to the highest factors that really limit or deny fair housing choice or opportunity and negatively impact fair housing or civil rights for protected classes that reside within the city. And now I will pass it on to my colleague Maya Abood that will get into a little bit of the story behind the data analysis that we conducted.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. This rainy morning. My name is Maya Abood. I'll be talking a little bit about what we did well and where we struggled. Like many jurisdictions here, we were working on our assessment of fair housing for our housing element as the state was still developing its final guidance. So there was a lot of room for growing in the process, and we'll talk about that. But one of the things we spent a lot of time on was trying to find the story behind the data. There's an incredible amount of data provided by the state and that we analyzed and mapped, but we really wanted to focus on what the key findings were that could be communicated to the public and decision makers in order to guide policies and programs. And I'm going to go through some of the key findings. I will say that none of the key findings are incredibly surprising to us, but the data and quantitative analysis did help us to articulate the scale of the fair housing problems in the city, and it spurred the public and decision makers into action, which is really important in achieving our fair housing goals. So this first finding, and it's going to be a little hard to see, but all of these maps and figures are available in our housing element, which is on our website. And this again is in our appendix, our fair housing appendix. So the first key finding is that the city is diverse overall, but remains highly segregated. And I'll just flag a couple of trends here. Again, it's very complex, the segregation patterns in the city. We're a very diverse city, but just a couple key findings here. The west side of the city and the Southwest Valley is primarily considered majority white or white and Asian, whereas South LA is Black and Latinx. East LA, Southeast LA, and the Northeast Valley are majority Latinx. And these are using the neighborhood categories that are developed by HCD and part of the mapping toolkit that they make available to all jurisdictions in doing their fair housing analysis. So we stuck with their categories in doing our analysis as well. And using these same categories, we looked at how racial segregation dictates access to opportunity. And we found using access to opportunity as defined by TCAC, again, these are maps that should be familiar to most folks on the call because they're part of the data package provided by the state. And you can see the map of opportunity areas in the city on this left-hand side of the slide. But we found that 100% of neighborhoods that are mostly white are high and highest resource. That's areas that have the highest performing schools, the least amount of environmental pollutants, and really where we're trying to get the most housing opportunity. In contrast, we found that 0% of mostly Latinx neighborhoods and Black and Latinx neighborhoods are high and highest resource. Again, those are the areas of the city in South LA, East LA, and the Northeast Valley. So 0% of those neighborhoods are high and highest resource. We also found that 65% of white residents in our city live in the highest opportunity areas, and 1 in 4 Black and Latinx residents live in high segregation, high poverty areas. Then when we're talking about who has access to healthy air, who has access to high-performing schools, this is a really important chart for us to use and understand. And just as like a data note, because I'm a little bit of a data nerd, I like using these two sets of analyses together. The previous one looked at neighborhood level segregation, and this is looking at segregation as it relates to the individual households. And both are really important in telling our story about how racial and economic segregation is precluding people from having full access to opportunity. We also found that zoning is a key contributor to our racial segregation, both historically and ongoing. We can talk more about some of the history that we've been focusing on, especially since the adoption. But in general, we analyzed our zoning patterns as it relates to the different opportunity areas developed by the state. We found that in areas that are considered racially concentrated areas of affluence, which for our housing element, we defined as majority white areas that had double the median income of the rest of the city. These areas, which actually represent quite a significant share of the city, about 183 census block groups, these areas of the residential zoning in these areas, only 5% allowed for multifamily housing. 95% was zoned exclusively for single family homes. For our highest resource areas, only 19% allowed for multifamily housing. And you contrast that with high segregation and high poverty areas, which is this box at the bottom of the slide. 82% of the residentially zoned land in these areas allows for multifamily. So given that zoning context, it's not surprising to us that there are clear disparities in where our affordable, deed-restricted affordable housing is in the city. Only 14% of our affordable housing units are located in these high and highest resource areas, and 35% of our deed-restricted affordable housing is in high segregation and high poverty areas. Our last finding was really important for this housing element, was a key concern of the community residents that were engaging in the process, and it relates to displacement. We found that displacement is continually threatening the economic and housing security of our Black, Indigenous, and people of color tenants and communities. We looked at various indicators to be able to quantify displacement and where it's happening the most. As you can see here, just a snippet of this. We looked at the demolition of our RSO units. RSO, again, is our rent stabilization ordinance, like rent control. And we see every year from 2015 to 2019, that number is increasing. RSO units tend to be older and have lower income and people of color living in them. We also did some initial analysis of which neighborhoods were facing the most gentrification. As Jackie talked about previously, part of our REAP project is to expand on this analysis, but for the purpose of the housing element, we did some initial mapping and analysis and found that neighborhoods like East Hollywood, Pico Union, and Westlake have very high gentrification forces. And these are areas that are disproportionately, have disproportionately tenants that are people of color and immigrants. So very concerning for us as staff and for the community. So that was the data analysis. Now moving into more of our programmatic successes on what we did well. And this was commended by HCD in our initial letter. We really focused in this housing element on redirecting our rezoning to high opportunity areas. If you're not already familiar, LA had a huge rezoning need. We've never had to rezone before for our housing element. And for this cycle, we needed to add an additional 255,000 units of capacity. That's unprecedented for us. And in our rezoning program in the housing element, we committed to 55% of that added capacity being in the highest resource and high resource neighborhoods. That was a firm commitment that we made to the state. And you can see here, looking at on the left here is our adequate sites inventory. So that's really a reflection of where zoning and market factors are expected to allow housing as it is today. Most of the housing we would anticipate to be developed is in downtown and kind of moving around from downtown, South LA, the Westlake, Pico, Union area, and a few parts of the Valley. But certainly not the highest and high resource areas that we showed you earlier, which are mostly on the west side and the Southwest Valley. In contrast, on the right, you see our rezoning candidate sites. And our rezoning is really focused on high and highest resource areas. So you can see West LA, Southwest Valley, particularly along the major corridors and boulevards is one of the key strategies. And we're still continuing to allow areas with high job concentration like downtown to have significant rezoning and areas near transit as well. Another thing that we did really well that was commended by the state is our commitment to addressing displacement. Our previous housing element had no discussion of displacement. We didn't talk about displacement. This was during the foreclosure crisis, and so most of the attention we had on housing was related to that. But we're in a very different time now, and we included many programs and policies specifically related to anti-displacement. I'm not going to go into all of them now, but we can talk about them more in the question section if folks are interested. And even since adoption, we've made significant progress in many of these programs. Another thing that we did really well was engaging traditionally excluded groups in our process. We provided a grant to the Liberty Hill Foundation, and Liberty Hill subcontracted with 4 community-based organizations. These organizations conducted focus groups with their members, and those conversations were less of the kind of webinars that we had been doing for our traditional outreach and much more conversations that linked how the fair housing analysis related to people's lived experience. And it allowed a kind of more informal environment for people who may be introduced to these topics for the first time, but have lived experience to be able to contribute. We had 64 people attend those sessions, and they were primarily Black and Latinx and in lower income neighborhoods. I'll just say that that was particularly important because of the demographics of our overall outreach. Our online survey, which we put a lot of emphasis in, had a large number of residents, but those residents who engaged were not demographically reflective of the city. And so that's why we needed to take a more proactive approach. Now we'll talk a little bit about some of the revisions that we had to make. We're going to go quickly through this because it's a little, these were our stumbling points. The first was the state flag that we needed to have more place-based strategies to address the needs of our high segregation and high poverty communities. And in LA, that was particularly challenging because we have 126 census tracts that are considered high segregation and high poverty. And this is a chart showing how that relates to other cities. By far, we have the most. And in share, we're more similar to a San Joaquin Valley than some of the higher resource areas on the coast. And it's very challenging for us to develop in a citywide document strategies that can encompass the community needs of places that are very diverse, like South LA and East LA and the Valley. But we were able, in our revision process, to add some really key programs that have become really important to us and we're committed to. And we can, again, talk about those more in the questions. We also struggled with setting metrics for some of our assessment of fair housing programs, and the state required that we do that in order to achieve compliance. And just an example of how we did that, we committed to a more equitable distribution of our affordable housing, deed restricted affordable units. And as part of our program 124 that Jackie talked about, we specifically added the metric that 8% of the units that our city finances would be in high opportunity areas. A couple other examples of metrics. But we were, at the end of this exercise, able to have a compliant housing element that we all felt really good about, and an assessment of fair housing that has continued to inform policy and programs. And I'm just going to turn it over to Nancy, to talk a little bit about how we're moving forward and building upon the assessment of fair housing. And then I do see a hand, and we'll take questions at the end.
Thank you, Maya. Good morning. My name is Nancy Twamakwaboa. As Maya indicated, I will be briefly presenting on the City of LA's current AFH process. The Los Angeles Housing Department and the Housing Authority of the City of Los Angeles collaborated to develop the City of LA's 2023 to 2028 Assessment of Fair Housing, as we've been referring to as AFH. The city retained Mosaic Community Planning as a consultant to partner with the Housing Department and the Housing Authority in the AFH development process. Also, again, Liberty Hill Foundation, as Maya spoke about through our housing element process, Liberty Hill Foundation was secured to help strengthen the community engagement component of our AFH work, and to also work with various community-based partners to hold focus groups and discussions with specific target groups to ensure we were reaching those who would otherwise would have been left out of the process or not able to voice their experiences and provide input about their fair housing barriers in the city. The city's AFH addresses the federal affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, as well as the state's requirement to take meaningful actions to do the following: overcome patterns of segregation, foster inclusive communities, reduce affordable housing needs, and address barriers that reduce access to opportunity, which was previously mentioned earlier in the presentation. The city's AFH consisted of a robust community engagement process over the course of several months. This included holding over 40 community meetings, focus groups, consultation sessions, and receiving over 500 AFH surveys from members of the public as well as stakeholders. So this is a list of the 5 goals that are within the city's assessment of fair housing plan, and they relate to increasing access to affordable housing, preserving affordable housing, preventing displacement, and then as well as expanding access to community assets. So the city's AFH is required to undergo approval by both the Housing Authority's Board of Commissioners and the city's council prior to submitting the final AFH to HUD for acceptance and for consideration. At this time, the AFH is scheduled to go before the Housing Authority's Board of Commissioners on February 8th, and the city anticipates receiving the final city council approval in March 2024. So this concludes our presentation, and we're available for any questions you may have at this time. Thank you.
Thank you to our City of LA speakers and Mayan Johnson. I will now entertain comments from members of the CEHD committee. Just a reminder, if a member of this body is attending remotely, but is not at a location specified on the agenda, they may observe, but may not participate in any discussion or voting of this body. I call on Mr. John Mirish.
And thank you so much for the presentation. I appreciate you. I have a few questions, but I'm first going to just note that existing zoning would allow LA to triple its current population despite DOF projections that LA is losing population. So my questions are, what did you find in looking at the role of income and wealth inequality in being an obstacle to AFFH? Also, when you're looking at access to opportunity, did you consider, we talk a lot here about the ability to do remote work, and for that, broadband access is critical. And did you look at that? Also, how did you consider ownership opportunities in the context of AFFH? For example, did your research show that minorities would prefer living in small to mid-size apartments, or would minorities prefer living in single-family neighborhoods in homes that they would own if they have a choice? And then finally, you mentioned that RSO units are older and not as in good shape as some newer units. That leads me to the question that I think that RSO units are generally older because of Costa-Hawkins. So is it your opinion that we should be repealing Costa-Hawkins? And again, thank you so much for your presentation.
Okay, should we do all questions first or one at a time? We'll do one at a time.
Yeah, please.
There's a lot to start with there.
Yeah.
so
Please
we'll
feel
start
free
there.
to respond as you wish.
Okay. So the first one I want to make sure I understood was related to economic and racial segregation.
No, it was actually income and wealth inequality.
Income
And
and
what
wealth.
roles do income and wealth inequality in society in general, how are they an obstacle? How did you find that they're an obstacle to AFFH?
Yeah, certainly one of our contributing factors. Income and wealth inequality changing in terms of the housing element, which is primarily focused on land use. The way that we thought about that is by allowing greater access to job centers. So increasing housing opportunity close to job centers and close to transit corridors that lead to job centers. We do find that, even in the COVID world, a lot of our lower income tenants and lower income households in the city are still dependent on working in person. If we think about custodial workers or retail workers or healthcare workers, there's not as much of an opportunity for remote work. So we were working on this in the midst of COVID. I don't know if this is going to be more of a discussion Nancy can talk about in our assessment of fair housing that we're working on for HUD. But certainly, the housing element is limited somewhat in its set of tools to being focused on land use. And part of our addressing income and wealth inequality is in creating more opportunities for job access. There's also some programs.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask in that context, did you consider anti-speculation policies? I mentioned ownership before, that would perhaps stop speculators from coming in and private equity and swooping up properties, precluding families and working people from perhaps having the opportunity to own their homes.
Yeah, we had as part of our anti-displacement strategies a number of ownership programs. Some of those were more traditional, like down payment assistance programs. Some of them are focused on trying to curb speculation. There's some work that's being done there, a couple of council motions that we're responding to. And then also looking at new models of ownership. I think we're grappling with how we densify as a city, particularly near transit, while still providing opportunities for ownership and thinking about what ownership might look like if it's shared equity ownership or other kinds of models. And so that's been another focus of the work.
And we do have a home ownership program in our housing element, which is an existing program of our housing department where we provide down payment assistance for middle income and lower income residents who want to own either a home or a condo.
Sorry, last question. Did you look at TOPA and COPA programs, Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, which I think exists in Washington, D.C., or Community Opportunity to Purchase Act? As multifamily buildings go up for sale, that gives the right of first refusal to either the community to purchase it for affordable housing or for the tenants to be able to have an ownership stake. These are programs that exist in other cities as well.
Yeah, we had TOPA COPA program in our housing element as one of our key programs for affirmatively furthering fair housing. I will say that at the time we wrote the housing element, we said explore the program because we were concerned about availability of funding. It's one thing to allow TOPA or COPA, but if you don't have a funding resource to help people buy the property, then it's much less impactful. The city recently passed Measure ULA, which would provide dedicated funding for preservation. So we are really hopeful that combined with a funding source, our TOPA COPA program will be developed and be more robust.
And if I may add, also for in regards to the TOPA COPA strategy, that's also advanced within our current AFH work as well. So that's one of the strategies within our 5-year plan. And keeping in mind what Maya just said, it's more so consideration in terms of funding availability to be able to move that effort forward. But it is part of our 5-year plan in terms of really being able to think about opportunities for tenants to be able to purchase properties if they wanted to and if they're able to, but also thinking about what the city is doing long-term wise in regards to United to House LA. There will also be opportunities through that work as well.
All right, thank you. I call on committee member Deborah Parada.
You know, in the data that's being collected here, I also would like to see data collected on and put side by side with this stuff, education scores. Our kids right now, state of California, 50% of them cannot read, write, or perform math at grade level. In the Los Angeles area, if you guys wanted to look at your scores, just so that you know where you stand in your different cities, it's CAschools-board.com, where you can look up your school, you can look up your district and the individuals in schools to see how they're performing. California, more than 50% of our kids can't read, write, or perform math. In the LA Unified, 50% can't perform math, 60% are not fluent, can't handle English. Here in the Inland Empire, 50% of our kids cannot read, write, or perform math. And how are these kids ever going to get a job that could afford them better housing? And I think this plays together. I mean, so until we can hold these school boards and superintendents accountable for the product that they're serving us, we're never going to be able to help everybody climb out of this mess. So I really, when we talk about housing, low-income housing, all those numbers, education needs to be a major component. How we, we'll never get it fixed if we don't get the education component addressed. Thank you.
In response to that, our 5-year AFH does address the disparities that exist in regards to education and education access. So there is discussion about that and data provided within our report. So we understand the importance of it, what it means in regards to education and housing and how those components do play with each other in regards to what's available to those who are in high segregation and high poverty areas and those who represent minority groups. So we do speak about that within our plan, and we do provide actual data in regards to that. Because we do know those who have low access to quality housing, affordable housing, also have limited access to proper education and proper education resources. So we do cover that within our plan.
Okay, thank you.
You know what, if you could send that to me, I'd like to see it. So.
Sure, I'll share the link to our project webpage that will have the link for our latest draft.
Thank you.
Yeah, and let's please, Ms. Macias, let's please make sure to get that to Deborah Parada. Okay, thank you again to Mayan Johnson and to our speakers from the city of Los Angeles. Item number 7, Preservation Strategy Project Update. Do we have any members of the public who wish to speak on this item?
Mr. Chair, I see no members of the public who wish to speak on item number 7.
Thank you, Ms. Macias. This is an information item. SCAG was awarded $47 million in REAP funding to support local governments and stakeholders with housing planning activities that accelerate housing production and meet the region's goals to produce new housing. As part of these efforts, SCAG partnered with RHNA advisors on the Preservation Strategy Project to address the growing risk of conversion of at-risk affordable units to market rate. Today, 2 consultants from RHNA advisors, Mr. Paul Silvern and Ms. Ada Peng, will present an overview of the project and key findings of their white paper with recommendations to preserve affordable housing in the SCAG region. I want to please let the committee members know that the PowerPoint for item number 6 and item number 7 will be sent to you after the meeting, after today's meeting. I turn it over to our speakers. Thank you.
With you in the committee this morning. We'll try to be brief and giving you an overview of this important topic, which we've been working on closely with your staff, and something that I'm sure that we'll be returning to you in the weeks and months ahead. I'll provide a brief overview about this assignment, which I'll note is another important REAP 1.0 task. Again, emphasizing the importance of this funding for helping SCAG to round out its understanding of critical regional planning issues. And then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Ada, who will provide a little more detail about the analytic work that we undertook on your behalf. There's information about Ada and me in your staff report, so I won't dwell on that here. But I do want to acknowledge the participation of our colleagues at the California Housing Partnership, which has been working on this issue for many years, among the many other kinds of research, technical assistance, and advocacy work that they do. They were very instrumental in helping with our data analysis of the types, numbers, and range of units that are affected in this category of at-risk rental housing, which we'll define for you. Just briefly note that we are a national economic development, real estate advisory, and housing consulting firm, and do quite a bit of housing-related consulting work around the region and the U.S. more generally. This topic of at-risk affordable housing is a relatively new one at the SCAG level, though perhaps more familiar to those of you who represent the larger cities in the region for where the stock of such housing is more heavily concentrated. But what we mean by at-risk affordable housing comes in 2 basic categories. The first has to do with those existing deed restricted or regulatory restricted affordable units that have some form of public subsidy or regulatory requirement to maintain a certain number of units as affordable, and where those restrictions are burning off. This is particularly true with some of the older HUD subsidized housing in the region, but it also applies to things like inclusionary units in some of your jurisdictions that have deed restrictions that have a lifetime to them that will expire at some point in time and are at risk of converting to market rate. But the other important category, and the one that we're going to focus on more specifically today, is what's referred to as naturally occurring affordable housing. These are older apartment buildings around the region that are sort of in the B and C class of quality, older, and happen to rent units at relatively low prices, but they're not subject to any kind of regulatory or deed restriction. And they are the targets of value-added developers very often who buy them and fix them up and convert them to market rate, and potentially cause significant displacement of the lower income households who are occupying those units. There's a very large stock of such buildings around the SCAG region, and obviously trying to preserve those units for as more affordable housing is an important topic. However, like a lot of other things, there just isn't any dedicated funding resource for this kind of work. As SCAG and other public agencies have experienced recently, there has been an interest by affordable housing developers, both private and public, seeking property tax exemptions as a strategy to help finance the acquisition and improvement of these kinds of units, and serious questions about the degree to which the scale of property tax exemption that's being sought trades off well with the affordable housing benefits that accrue. So that's the focus of what we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Ada to go through some more specific information about that.
Thank you, Paul. So as Paul mentioned, there are two types of at-risk affordable housing. And the first type is the naturally occurring affordable housing, or so-called NOAA units. And the second type is the deed-restricted affordable units with expiring deed. And we often classify them at risk when they're approaching the covenants within 10 years. And so just a quick example, for example, if you see a fourplex in the Chinatown neighborhood or South LA that are around $300,000 per unit, and they're providing rent at $1,600 for existing renters, these are properties that are naturally affordable to existing renters. But if an investor acquire this property, fix it up, they might be looking at renting it at the current market rate, which might be at $2,000 monthly rent. So there's potential displacement risk with that. Next slide. And so we want to provide a little bit more market context and recognizing that the market condition across counties vary a lot. And we look at census data and found out that since 2017, 700,000 properties become unaffordable, which means that the households who are living there are paying more than 30% of their income on housing. And 29% of renters in the SCAG region are extremely cost burdened, meaning that they pay more than 50% of their income on housing. And we also have a pretty old housing stock in general. The average year built is 1961. And the map on the right shows the regional variance across the 6 counties in the SCAG region. So as we know that each county have their different area median income, and also the local average market rents is different. So what we're trying to understand is how much households income you need compared to your area median income in order to afford an average rent housing unit in your region. So for example, if you look at LA County, you have to earn 120% of the Los Angeles area median income in order to afford an average rental units in LA. However, if you look at Imperial County, you need to earn 66% of Imperial County's area median income in order to afford an average rent in Imperial County. And rent growth across the SCAG region has also been uneven, and these all have implications that affects policy decisions for NOAA preservation. And as mentioned, that not all the NOAA units are at risk, and it is essentially NOAA units that are in submarkets with rapidly changing and economic growth that face higher pressure for market investment. And the charts here are showing census tract with more than 30% changes in monthly rent over the past 10 years, which translates to around 3% per year. So as we can see, with all these counties, the increase in rent growth is rather dispersed across the counties, but we can see that in LA County, more census tracts has experienced rapid growth in the past 10 years. Similarly, we see also the same pattern for San Bernardino, Ventura, and Imperial County, that the rent growth is really different across even within each county. So one thing we want to highlight is that as part of our study, we also formed a preservation advisory committee that have provided us very valuable on-the-ground feedback, and they are members from the traditional affordable housing developers, nonprofit, community-based organizations, organizations that provide supports to tenants, and also private mission-driven developers that are very passionate about preserving at-risk NOAA units. So we had 4 sessions with them, and they have provided some key insights. So some of the common feedback and takeaways from the PAC, the Preservation Advisory Committee, is that currently, there are no established programs or funding sources for this type of at-risk rental housing. And because there's a lot of variance in market condition, NOAA preservation really require a regional approach. And the housing units across SCAG region also have very different housing typologies and scale of preservation opportunities. So for example, if we're talking about preserving a property with 50 units, it's a very different strategy than preserving a 4-plex or single family homes. And also we've heard that the gap in financing is larger than what property tax exemption can cover. We've heard a lot from increasing insurance cost, property management cost, and so local and regional jurisdictions should consider other incentives that goes along with property tax exemption. And lastly, these are projects that are very different than the traditional affordable housing development, and special technical assistance is required in order to successfully preserve these NOAA projects and manage them on an ongoing basis. So for the last section, we want to summarize some of our key observations and provide some considerations for NOAA preservation strategies. Our team developed a cost-benefit analysis tool to provide insights for local jurisdictions to evaluate how the community benefits compare to potential cost when jurisdictions provide support to preserve NOAA preservation transactions. So to illustrate, if jurisdictions receive an application seeking for property tax abatement, saying that the applicant is acquiring this 50-unit property, they want to cap the rent at 80% AMI. In return, they want to ask for property tax exemption for the same length of years, say 55 years. So this tool will help jurisdictions to evaluate how much rent savings you're going to get when the applicant put a cap on 80% AMI and maybe also capping the rent increase at 2%. How does that compare to leaving this property on the market? And also, what are the actual costs to jurisdictions losing property tax income for the local share for that 55-year period? And so we did some illustrative analysis, and one common finding, which is consistent with what we heard from PAC, is that property tax abatement alone cannot close the financing gap for a lot of these NOAA preservation projects, because we are talking about Class C properties, a lot of them with deferred maintenance. So even though their acquisition cost is a lot lower than ground up development projects, there is substantial rehab cost involved as well. And we also summarize some considerations in terms of how jurisdictions can support the preservation of NOAA properties. So first, we want to recognize that there are both quantitative and qualitative benefits to preserve NOAA properties. And these qualitative benefits would include improved habitability conditions, prevent displacement, and also increased access to resources, because a lot of these are in areas with rapid growth and high resources. Second, NOAA preservation requires different forms of public subsidies, and on top of property tax exemption, gap financing comes with different types and terms. So for example, jurisdictions could provide acquisition financing support, and these often come in the form of a strike fund that really provide quicker access to funding for affordable housing or mission-driven developers to allow them to compete with private investors. And jurisdictions can also consider providing low-cost permanent financing to enable operators to maintain and renovate existing housing units. Third, we want to highlight the limitation of tax and fee exemptions, because these preservation deals do require a lot support, and sometimes providing tax and fee exemptions might not be sufficient to make the NOAA preservation deal pencil. Fourth, the length of affordability deed restrictions also has significant financial impact. So for example, if you're applying a 55-year deed restriction on a property versus applying a 10-year deed restrictions, it would have different impacts on the financial feasibility of the transaction. Five, as mentioned, we have to consider both acquisition cost and the cost of renovations when evaluating these projects. And lastly, we do want to emphasize that there's an increasing need of having an ecosystem to support these NOAA preservation efforts, because they are essentially a very different model than the traditional affordable housing ground-up development. And lastly, we also want to summarize some of the key opportunities for jurisdictions at different levels to support NOAA preservation. So at the state level, currently, based on AB 787, jurisdictions are permitted to claim credits up to 25% for the RHNA goals if they convert existing housing to deed restricted affordable housing. So if there is a larger share of RHNA allocation to be met through NOAA preservation, local jurisdictions will have more incentive to support these programs. And we also want to explore the possibility of expanding property tax welfare exemption to all NOAA units, irrespective of the types of investors, but definitely have to comes with appropriate and enforceable rent restrictions. At the state level, it is also critical to continuously to look for reliable funding and financing programs to support preservation. At the regional level, there needs to be concerted effort to monitor the at-risk NOAA stock, recognizing that the NOAA properties vary in their building typologies and locations. And so we think it's really important to track these NOAA units over time, and also provide capacity support for property owners and operators to continuously preserve these units. And similarly, there's opportunity to explore regulatory changes, including property tax exemptions, but also other types of public subsidies and support. Finally, at the local level, jurisdictions should explore programs and funding sources to capture preservation opportunities based on local context and housing typologies. Provide or enable capacity building for operators and owners, and also review options to similarly provide different types of subsidies and support. So I think that concludes our presentation, and I'll pass it to Paul.
Yeah, well, that's all we wanted to cover with you today. So while this is a relatively new aspect of affordable housing for SCAG, I hope you'll agree that preserving the affordable housing that we do have and taking advantage of the opportunity to convert lower priced units that do exist in the region to affordable housing should play a prominent role in SCAG's approach to affordable housing and the approach that each of your jurisdictions takes individually, so that while we're doing a lot of work to try to expand the supply, we're taking care to preserve what we already have. Thank you. Be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Silvern and Ms. Peng. I will now entertain comments from members of the CEHD committee. Just a reminder, if a member of this body is attending remotely, but is not at a location specified on the agenda, they may observe, but may not participate in any discussion or voting of this body. I call on John Mirisch.
Thank you. And as a board member of La Casa, and I see my fellow board member Jed Liano has a question coming up too, I will agree that preservation, one of our big 3 Ps, is extremely important and we should be focusing on it. A couple of specific questions. One, you talked about the length of covenants. Shouldn't we be looking at creating affordability covenants in perpetuity, or at least as long as the property is residential? In those cases where, for example, the developer is getting a density bonus or they're getting some consideration,